So this is actually a surprisingly smooth segue, believe it or not, into another key issue facing the archaeology sector in Britain today, and that is namely the general election. We're currently in the election season. Folks are out electioneering, which is a brilliant word. I've always loved that word, electioneering. It's I think there's a Radiohead song called electioneering, and well, you have had the unmitigated pleasure of going through the different manifestos, statements, policies, and priorities of.
It's a tough job, but somebody has to do it.
And you also sent me a little manifesto pressis document or pressy document, which is beautifully. It's 25 pages of just the relevant material from these manifestos. And I have to say, one thing that slightly stuck in my craw and stuck out to me right from the beginning is the incumbent party, and they've got a bit of an issue, I think, with cult of personality. In so much as in the last election, the election was all about support Theresa May, not vote Conservative, support Theresa May, get Brexit done or whatever, and now it's back Boris. The reason why, I mean, obviously I'm slightly annoyed by that because we don't have a presidential system. It's not a republic or a whatever. But it's also a situation where this, from the incumbent party right the way down through the manifestos, it's clear that agendas are very focused on things that are not archaeology. Obviously, Brexit is one of the backgrounds to this election. Labour seems
It's the
to be.
reason it's happening.
Yeah, exactly. Labour, the key party of opposition, seems to have a focus um, on what they would term real change. The idea being pushing towards a bit more of a stance on, for example, things like social justice, so on and so forth. In particular, wealth redistribution and privatising elements of our national, for example, train networks and so on and so forth. And then the other parties, the SNP, Plaid Cymru in Wales, and the Green Party also have manifestos that are driven by their particular constituencies and concerns. And none of that, understandably, really, is explicitly about archaeology. So, where are you going to start? Where are you going to kick us off on this?
Right. Just to give us as you say, the manifestos. If we tried to look at every manifesto in detail, we'd end up that way madness lies, because they're far too complex, far too different to do that. So, what I'd like to do is sort of reflect it all through the mirror of a manifesto which isn't from a political party. It's called the Heritage Manifesto.
Okay.
It's produced by the Heritage Alliance, which is a representative body for the great and the good in heritage and archaeology, organisations like Historic England, English Heritage, National Trust, and so on. And
Sorry, the great
every
and the
general
good.
election,
Great and the good.
you might have seen the quotation marks as I was saying that. Our friends and colleagues at those organisations.
Sorry. I should just say what I had in mind there was Bosworth Field and some of the issues that we've had there in terms of planning process.
We might go there later.
Yeah,
See how this turns out. But basically, the Heritage Alliance produces a manifesto for every general election, where they note, they put down a marker really for the place of heritage in the UK economy, and then they put forward recommendations to enhance the contribution that heritage can make to the UK economy. So, for example, in the Heritage Manifesto 2019, and we'll link to this below, they say, motherhood and apple pie, our heritage is one of our greatest national assets. From our rich architectural tradition to our ancient and distinctive landscapes, from exquisite objects, archaeological sites and historic vehicles, to stunning religious buildings, museums and preserved ships. That's pretty comprehensive. It stresses the thing.
Did you say motherhood and apple pie?
Motherhood. There's a motherhood and apple pie statement.
Oh right, okay. I was just like, am I looking at the wrong document? But no, okay. And the rest of it.
No, but
okay.
Actually, pies are important. If you go to various parts of the country, pies of various kinds are very important parts of heritage cuisine.
Okay.
Cornish pasty.
Well, Cornish pasty. Yeah. Also, bread buns up here in the northeast. The slotty.
Absolutely.
You know?
Yeah, absolutely.
Chelsea buns.
Bakewell tarts and all the rest of it.
Yeah, yeah.
Yep. Anyway, what they stress. How can, I think we're getting a bit demob happy here because trying to treat this subject seriously with British politics at the moment as it is difficult. It's one of those national you've got to laugh or you cry moments I think to many people. But anyway, battling on.
Well, actually, that is worth just touching on, actually, in so much as we do have at least a viewer from outside the UK, and that viewer may or may not be aware of the fact that actually this election was recently described in, well, at least one national newspaper by various commentators as being one where untruths are utterly rampant.
I'll come back to that.
Yeah, well, and in that sense, the status of truth and what is true about these documents is rightly going to make you raise an eyebrow, shall we say? So yes, there is an element of being a little bit demob happy, and
I think also it's worth saying that the for the UK to be having a general election in December is very, very unusual.
Yeah,
this has been done for purely political reasons. Initially by the current government, who wanted to get an election as soon as possible, aided and abetted, and some would say, in the way that the campaign is turning out, in a way that is catastrophically mistaken by particularly the Scottish National Party and the Liberal Democratic Party, the Liberal Democrats, with Labour belatedly getting on board with allowing an early election. That's it's a political argument, but one which, particularly if the result goes a particular way, will probably cost some people their careers. Yeah. Anyway, what the Heritage Alliance does is put down a marker really as to how it would hope heritage would be treated and how important it is. So, for example, they say that the heritage industry directly contributes 13.1 billion in gross added value, GVA, to the UK economy, which is larger than the security industry, the defence industry, and aerospace. Indirectly, it's argued it contributes 29 billion, or 2% of the gross value added of the economy, and employs directly 196,000 people. It notes that 15 times more people visit heritage attractions than attend Premier League football matches now in the course of a year. It notes that the heritage sites and World Heritage sites, like Highclere Castle, is associated with Downton Abbey. Now they say there'd be no Downton without Highclere. Actually, it was chosen by the location managers, but hey, there are other stately homes are available. They've got slightly more traction, I think, with the idea that there'd be no pole dark without the mines, because obviously the Cornish tin industry was a critical part and in creating the landscape of parts, at least in modern Cornwall.
True, although my understanding is you could simply take that man topless and give him a scythe and there would be pole dark. People would watch that.
yeah, absolutely. But yeah, actually, yes, he could be farming cereals in, say, Derbyshire or Nottinghamshire, and it would be coal mines rather than tin mines.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah.
But the point stands. Yes.
It also points out that it argues that heritage is a public good. It can be used in economic and social regeneration. It can enhance well-being. It depends on partnerships between public and private sectors working together. And then they put down what they want political parties to do. They want political parties to champion our unique heritage sector on the world stage, maximising opportunities in the event of Brexit and minimising challenges. They want to maintain and improve heritage protection. They want to promote heritage assets as part of placemaking, creating vibrant places to live in, and also sector skills and capacity. They want to reform the tax regime to promote and repair and maintenance of our nation's quotes irreplaceable heritage assets while tackling climate change, and they want to continue to back a National Lottery Heritage Fund, which at the moment actually isn't really in question. So some of those are things that are very easy to accept. Others require detailed policy statements, and I think you'll find it in general as you go through the manifestos. It's there that you'll find the response to this lacking.
Okay. Okay. So they've laid out the stall. That's the high watermark that they're aiming for, as it were.
That's right. Yep.
Where should we start with the incumbents? Should we start with the Conservatives?
If we must. No. Again, I'm talking here as a reporter. I'm trying to be impartial.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can sum up the entire Conservative manifesto in, well, 3 words and then perhaps another subclause. The entire Conservative manifesto is summarised by their tagline for the entire campaign, which is "Getting Brexit Done."
Right. Yeah.
And in a sense, this entire campaign is about that.
Mm-hmm.
It's about whether Brexit gets, quote, done
Mm-hmm.
by the Conservative Party and Prime Minister Boris Johnson, or whether it gets recooked in some other way by either a Labour majority government or, more likely on current polling, if Johnson doesn't get a majority, on some form of coalition.
Okay.
Again, as far as the Conservative Party is concerned, the subclause is getting Boris Johnson elected to the job he's always wanted. Since the time as a child, he said he wanted to be king of the world.
Indeed. But nonetheless, what do the Conservatives want to do, or what have they said about history, culture, and heritage?
Right. Very, very little.
Okay.
That most of the Conservative manifesto is to do, the bits that aren't about Brexit are to do with introducing more money and more staff to the NHS, which has got them into various amounts of trouble. They're claiming 50,000 more nurses will be appointed. In fact, 19,000 of those are nurses that are already in the NHS, which they're going to try and persuade not to leave.
Well, actually, in that sense, what they've actually said is that there will be 50,000 more nurses at a certain date, and if you stop some of them from leaving their jobs, then that is technically true. That's how they've qualified that, isn't it?
Yeah. This is from the people who repurposed their official Twitter feed as a fact check.
Yes.
For briefly during the campaign earlier on. They talk about net zero carbon emissions by 2050. They talk about green energy. They talk about millions more invested every week in science schools and apprenticeships. They talk about, particularly an Australian-style points system to control immigration, because if we do leave the EU, then freedom of movement for EU citizens will end. They talk about more police, tougher sentencing, and so on. Of the things that are peripherally relevant to particularly the higher education sector, where obviously many of our colleagues in archaeology work, they talk about actively recruiting leaders in the field to come to the UK, and they offering people who win top scientific prizes fast-track entry, and so on. They talk about a capital program for local libraries and regional museums, but that's only 250 million, which spread across the entire country is a packet of peanuts.
Yeah.
Actually, in government terms.
Mm.
They talk about a community ownership fund to encourage local takeovers of civic organisations and community assets, and they mention local football clubs, but also landmark buildings like pubs and post offices, which can be again in landmark and notable and listed buildings and so on. But again, they're only talking about 150 million quid.
Do you know something that comes to mind though? When you talk about local football clubs. During the Olympics back in 2012, do you know what sport the northeast of England got as a demonstration of the magnificence of international sport and the coming together of different countries?
I have to say I can't remember. We were just up the road from one of the stadiums that was where they were doing the shooting, but
Yes,
we had here in Woolwich.
You got shooting. Okay, that's interesting.
We had shooting and 3-day eventing in Royal Borough Greenwich.
Okay, that's interesting. Newcastle got football,
which is entirely logical, as you play quite a lot of it up there.
But my point is, it was nothing new. It was simply more of the same, and I feel a little bit as though there's a bit of that going on here as well. More of the same. and not much. I'm not hearing much in the way of a vision or growth or change or something that's dynamic or going to be
No.
challenging. It's going to bring something
To be
culturally dynamic
No,
into
no,
this.
no. To be honest, I think that there's an element of cut and paste about this. I mean, you know, one of the things that could have a direct impact on archaeology in terms of contract archaeology is in the planning system. And there's a quote: "We will make the planning system simpler for public and small builders and support modern methods of construction." They want a target of to achieve a target of 300,000 new homes a year by the mid-2020s. Now, first of all, that's over at least 5 years, and secondly, the current build is practically zero.
Yeah.
For
Partly because
affordable housing.
partly because of Brexit uncertainty.
You might say that, I couldn't possibly comment. But it's. But they do. To be fair to them, they do say that, as all the parties do, that they're going to maintain free entry to national museums, which would otherwise charge.
Okay.
Um,
So is that it for the Conservatives, or?
well, no, because the other one though is it's the B word. Our UK viewer might remember that one of the changes that Boris Johnson made in his alleged deal with the European Union, his oven-ready deal, ready to just put in the microwave and ting, was that they changed they downgraded the commitment to maintain the quotes level playing field, which is to maintain EU environmental and workers' rights and so on, and that is here in the manifesto. They say, "We will end the supremacy of European law. We will be free to craft legislation and regulations that maintain high standards, but which work the best for the UK. We want a balance of rights, rules, and entitlements that benefits all the people and all the parts of our United Kingdom." Now, what many people fear is that will mean a watering down of particularly things like environmental regulations and the polluter pays principle, which funds contract archaeology.
Yeah, and what's interesting there is that during the Brexit referendum, one of the arguments made by that side of the debate was that actually European standards are baseline. In fact, they're designed to act as basic minimum standards that countries are expected to go above and beyond and legislate their own laws, inverted commas, legislate their own laws in addition to those basic standards that they've signed up to as members of the European Union. So this is being painted as freedom from the supremacy of those things, but actually it may in fact be, as you say, an excuse to not have to live up to that basic standard. Okay. And polluter pay, obviously, in this instance, relates to people who are enacting damage or destruction or churning up of the ground and environment, or even polluting in the context of building, which otherwise wouldn't be there were it not for their own actions. So things like developers funding archaeology because
precisely
that archaeology wouldn't be disturbed otherwise. Okay.
Precisely.
Okay.
Now, I think we should perhaps look at this just very. This isn't to downplay the other parties, but there are really only two parties that are going to form the largest groups in Westminster after December the 12th, and the other one is the Labour Party, so perhaps I should look at the Labour Party next. Labour Party led by Jeremy Corbyn, who has been the beneficiary of a similar cult of personality, some might argue. He's alternatively seen as, JC, the great messiah who's going to lead us to the socialist promised land, or as his opponents say, he is an over-promoted idealist with some very unfortunate friends, and who has developed the nickname of Magic Grandpa because his followers, the way his followers see his every move and comment. The Labour Party manifesto, it doesn't go heavily on Corbyn, and in fact very few of the Labour election communications that I've seen, in fact our local Labour candidate, there is not a mention or a picture of Jeremy Corbyn on his election flyer, and that is because he's extremely unpopular according to the current polls.
Well, he's certainly divisive.
He's a divisive figure.
Yeah.
He's a very Marmite politician. But what Labour have done is come out very strongly with what they're arguing is a transformative manifesto, which offers pretty much everything to everyone.
Yes.
And that is what people have been criticising, because they, in a form of literature which is probably one of the most derided and degraded in the country in terms of how people regard political manifestos. This is an example of people thinking, well, wait a minute, it's wonderful to say you're going to renationalise this and renationalise that and provide these rights and this minimum wage and so on, but how the heck are you going to pay for it? And particularly if in the current economic climate, and particularly if Brexit happens and the economy tanks, as all the economists say it would do, to a greater or lesser extent.
Yeah. Now, interestingly, this is something which this is a criticism that seems to be laid at Labour's door, on their doorstep, far more readily than the Conservatives. Borrowing has gone up during the Conservatives' reign in the past 10 years, even though they paint themselves as, and they're characterised as, the party of economic responsibility, and being spendthrift. Is that the right word? Spendthrift. And prioritising the national books. In the case of another key opposition party, the Liberal Democrats, they're suggesting downright spending based on borrowing, and in fact the Greens go even further, suggesting £100 billion a year be spent over the course of the Parliament on basically transformative action to do with the economy and making it a greener and arguably a more sustainable place to live.
And the climate change emergency as they define it, absolutely.
Exactly, yeah. And of course Labour have, I noticed in your notes here, Labour have definitely gone in on the climate change emergency as a key element of their policies. But
all the parties except the Conservatives have done that. The Conservatives are much more... famously last week, Boris Johnson refused to take part in a Channel 4 debate about climate change and was replaced by a block of melting ice.
Yeah, because he couldn't stand it.
Yes, Some people argue that that was more coherent as a policy than the Conservatives, but I couldn't possibly comment on that. I mean, what I would say about the Labour Party, in terms of archaeology and heritage, I think if any elements of the Labour Party manifesto do get implemented, either through a Labour government or a coalition, it's going to be around issues like they commit to, for example, restoring funding to local authorities. Who are in charge of planning, and
but also who look after archives, for example.
Look after archives, libraries, local museums, and so on. So that could reduce some of the pressure there.
There's also the Labour policy of laying an awful lot of essentially introducing high-grade fibre internet to, in their words, everyone in the country. I don't know if that's qualified in terms of the Scottish Islands or not. But what's interesting there is that ties in, interestingly, as a counterpoint, or indeed a complement to the HS2 project, which definitely has archaeological implications. If you increase the capacity, for example, for you and I to have a glitch-free Skype conversation, that would do us wonders.
Yes.
And arguably, there may well come from that, as part of that laying down of fibre, some archaeological work, watching briefs, this kind of thing.
I'll come back to HS2 in a minute, if I may, actually.
That's fine. But I suppose this thing about Labour not having a particular focus, I agree. They seem to have essentially promised the moon on a stick across society. They're trying to hit everyone in terms of demographics. And on the one hand, you could say, well, how are they going to pay for fibre optics? How are they going to move towards a 4-day working week? How are they going to do this, that, and the other that they've talked about in the past couple of months? But I think in terms of the potential impact on archaeology, I think it would be intriguing. It'd be intriguing to see how that would play out in opposition to things like HS2. But we'll come back to HS2 in a moment.
Absolutely. I mean, give you a couple of other headlines. Labour can, as opposed to the Conservatives, 250 million. Labour are committing, in the manifesto at least, £1 billion to what they call a cultural capital fund to transform libraries, museums and galleries. They talk about, again, they also commit to maintaining free entry to national museums, And on the environment, they talk about legally binding targets to restore species and habitats. They talk about landscaping, renewing and improving protected area designations from national parks downwards to local nature reserves and urban green spaces. Mm-hmm. So, there's a lot of things here. The other things that would affect, for example, archaeological companies are things like a higher minimum wage, higher, improved, and I'm not saying these are bad things, far from it, but improved maternity and paternity rights and so on. Mm-hmm. It enhanced equality protections. They're going to remove 0 hours contracts. They're going to give workers rights from the first day of their contracts, and so on. So it is a major rebalancing. Some people say it's actually not that revolutionary if you look at it in German or Swedish or Danish terms. It's Northern European social democracy. And not rabidly mad Marxist theory that some people on the right are trying to present it as. I think there is a consensus though that maybe they're trying to do just too much, and there's a sense that maybe the wing of the Labour Party that's now currently in control has been wanting to say and do this for 20, 30 years. And they finally got their hands on the levers of power, and they're just letting it all out at once. And that maybe a more focused campaign would have been more effective, but we'll see.
Well, potentially, I think this coming back to this idea of how truth is being questioned in terms of this election. It is interesting that that Mr. Johnson. I try not to call him Boris Johnson because he's not a cuddly teddy bear. Mr. Johnson. So, yes. As I would have said, Mr. Cameron, yes. Or Mrs. May,
or Prime Minister Boris Johnson,
exactly.
Or, give him a title. Yeah, no, absolutely. In fact, a lot of journalists have been pushing back at this idea that he's exactly. That it somehow gives him a free pass.
It does, yeah. But it's interesting how Mr. Johnson's response to this notion of introducing high quality internet. Universally, essentially laying out a new infrastructure in the same way that one might have done with sewerage systems or something like that at some point, was pushed back against in the words of saying this is a crazy Marxist notion. I don't think there's anything that Marx mentions ever about fibre optic internet.
No.
I
think he had a pop at sort of capitalist monopolies like Microsoft, but anyway. Or near monopolies. No, actually, that was the chapter of Das Kapital that I lost, missed out on.
Exactly. And I suppose it's also worthwhile just saying as well for the record. I think it's fair to say that we've gone into more detail on these opposition policies than we did really on the conservative policies.
There's more of it.
Well, there's more of it, but also I think there's it's fair to say that commenting on what might change is always easier. Yes. So that is to say that actually I'm not necessarily saying I want to vote Labour or vote Conservative in this instance. What I'm interested in is what's being said. So Labour seems to be saying more, at least. Whether or not they can do it, that's another matter, I guess. Do you want to talk about HS2?
I will do briefly. I would just say on what you've just said. Mm-hmm. The choice really is between a more of the same, possibly slightly more adventurous, right of centre, broadly speaking, non-interventionist, unless it's seen as politically expedient, economic policy, more populism on the side of things like community relations, the police, and crime and punishment, and so on.
And also, crucially, deregulation as well.
And deregulation, yeah. Or a much more broad attempt to reconfigure society to remove what the Labour Party would say are the most egregious examples of the free market, and particularly protect the poorest and weakest members of society, and also the young. When we've got more children living in poverty than almost ever in modern times, certainly, and also the use of things like food banks and so on.
Yeah. Well, actually, it's interesting. I suppose in that sense, what you could say then about this offering between the incumbent and the main opposition, or rather say Her Majesty's opposition, I guess, would be to say that what we have here actually is people who are appealing to very different stakeholders. Arguably, for the first time in some time, I think ever since, to a certain extent, really ever since New Labour in 1997. The so-called middle ground, centre ground, has been the hallowed ground. It's been what everyone's been fighting over, and for a long time, adults and as I entered voting age as well, would complain that there's very little in it. You can't really tell the difference between the two. At the very least, this time, you can tell the difference between these two offerings. But that said, though,
except on the other issue. The issue of the day, which is, of course, the B word.
Yeah.
And there you have a party that's saying, get Brexit done, which everybody who knows anything about the subject knows is a completely fatuous argument, because Brexit will not be done and dusted on December the 12th.
No.
It is going to take years. In fact, a colleague who works in the law reckon there'll be people who would spend their entire career on trying to sort out the ramifications of Britain leaving the EU in terms of just legal regulation and so on.
Well, that's it's going to be between 2 and 20 years at least, isn't it?
Yeah. And that's just to do the physical moving out bit. But the other thing that and the Labour Party, which again one of the problems that it's been perceived as having is trying to please all people all the time. The Conservatives have very definitely gone for what they see as the Brexit vote, and according to the referendum, that's around 52% of the population. In fact, the figures appear to have changed, and there's currently a Remain majority because of first past the post elections rather than proportional elections, which we have in Britain. You don't need to have a majority of the people to gain a very large majority in Parliament.
It's also fair to say that the 52% wasn't the majority of the people. It was the majority of the people who turned up to
vote. Whereas Labour have tried, with a large number of Labour constituencies having voted leave in the referendum, but also many of their constituencies, but also particularly their membership and activists, being very pro-Remain and internationalist in outlook. They've been trying to walk this very difficult tightrope between the two sides, and at the moment they're offering a renegotiation of Johnson's deal with a people's vote to either adopt Labour's deal or Remain at the end of the process, however long that would take.
Now this is that's important because on the surface, especially to our non-UK viewer, that may sound as though that is just deep politics. We've gone full politique, and we're not actually talking about what we're here to talk about in terms of archaeology and heritage and culture. But it's important because the other opposition parties, for the most part, have taken a stance based on Brexit as well, and this stance has an impact on their ability to deliver, and also, broadly speaking, their vision for the relevance of things like, for example, culture and heritage in a post non-Brexit world. So if somehow, for example, the next party I guess we should look at would be the Liberal Democrats. If they were to get a majority, they're extraordinarily unlikely to do so. But if they were to get a majority,
particularly after this morning, when their tour bus was ambushed by Extinction Rebellion, which the people dressed as bees have been gluing themselves to the Liberal battle bus.
Wow, that's very British. But if they were to get a majority, then they would immediately stop the Brexit process and embark on a round of spending. So they say. But that has an impact though on culture and archaeology and heritage policy and environment policy. In what way then? What would the Lib Dems do if they could do it?
Well, basically, if we stay within the current European regime, then we stay within the current European environmental regulations and things like that, and would and working rights and working people's rights and so on.
And would they do anything above and beyond that, given that, as we say, that's a minimum status?
I think at the moment that is questionable, but they certainly they're sort of roughly halfway between the Green Party and the current status quo in terms of, for example, environmental issues. I would say. I mean, they the Liberal Democrats are an odd beast in that. Famous, you talk to Labour activists and they spit feathers at the words Liberal Democrat, because they talk about yellow Tories, whereas you go to a Conservative leaning part of the country and one of the problems the Liberal Democrats would face would be to be seen as enablers of a Labour government. So and maybe they are an example of the old saying that. If you stand in the middle of the road, you get hit by traffic from both sides. It's certainly the case that on current polling, the Liberal Democrats are being squeezed between the Conservatives and Labour, and that certain judicial votes are going home. I mean,
but for example, we have here a policy to ensure the sustainability lies at the heart of fisheries policy. There is increasing the budget for Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, which has an impact actually on land management. That also has an impact on archaeological sites as well.
Yeah, well, they do believe, the Liberal Democrats as a philosophy, they believe in devolution to local community decision making and things like that, historically, rather than the Conservatives, who are seen as more centralising, and Labour, which is seen as a more command economy as well. Albeit from a different political perspective.
Investing in large-scale restoration of peatland, heathland, native woodland, salt marshes, wetland, coastal waters, and helping to absorb carbon, protecting against floods, improving water quality, protecting habitats, so on and so forth. So it all sound. A lot of that is. You can't argue against it. You can't say, I think that's a bad idea.
Oh no, absolutely not.
But I guess there's an awful lot there that's not being stated, if that's what I mean, isn't there? In terms of actual implementation and implications of that.
And again, I have to say, with all parties that aren't Labour and Conservative, what they're doing is, they're saying this is what we do if we're in government. They know darn well they're not going to be in government, not under first past the post. No. So they're wish lists then, basically. These are wish lists, absolutely. So as a punter, as a voter, you have to go with the party that perhaps is closest to what you believe, or, as again polling is showing, because of Brexit. And it's a complete unknown quantity at the moment, but it does appear that what's called tactical voting is going to be much more prominent in the current election than possibly in previous elections, i.e. you vote to keep out the person you like least.
Okay.
So, for example, a Labour or Liberal Democrat voter might vote for Labour or Liberal Democratic Party to keep out a Conservative. A Conservative might vote for a Brexit party, or a Brexit party supporter might vote for a Conservative rather to keep out a Remainer.
Yeah.
This is
you've just stumbled into something that's very common in British political vernacular at the moment, but again, maybe foreign to people who aren't citizens or living here at the moment, and that is the interchangeable way in which people use terminology like Conservative, Labour, Remain, Leave. Brexit has broken everything. And it has split conventional policy statements and conventional party positions in ways that are very difficult to understand. So, for example, a Brexit party supporter may well be Labour, from a Labour working background.
Policy. Yeah, absolutely.
And for example, this definitely applies here in the northeast of England.
Absolutely.
But they may find themselves voting Conservative, depending on what the Labour politician is suggesting on Brexit.
We're seeing a lot of constituency profiles that are saying just that at the moment. I mean, you've got the case of, famously, Hartlepool on the northeast coast. Famously, it was Peter Mandelson's constituency under New Labour. It's currently being contested, and he's in with a shout of getting it by Richard Tice, the chairman of the Brexit Party.
Okay. Sorry, I gave away my non-partisan stance there with a slight look of horror.
Yeah.
We'll come to Brexit Party Ltd in just a moment. The Green Party, though, is an interesting one in terms of this other category, because they do talk about creating codes and an ecocide law that prevents crimes against the natural environment. There's talk here about banning mineral extraction and road building. For example, fracking would have a much harder time under a green policy. But also increasing access to national parks, opening up free car park access, for example, new cycle routes, walking routes, and bus links. And what's interesting, though, the reason why I mentioned that is, again, that does have an implication in terms of access to the historical world. Lots of castles, for example, in North Wales, are very close to national parking places. And where the Greens lead, actually, other parties follow. There's a reason that Labour are are pushing prominently a position on the natural environment and climate change crisis, so-called, because of things like Greens, but also actually as an extension of that worldview, things like Extinction Rebellion. So it's interesting. It's worthwhile just sort of touching on that.
And you're absolutely right. I wouldn't disagree with anything you said there. And I think it's also fair to say that the Green Party does have a reasonable take-up of support within the archaeological profession. I think for a long time I've been arguing that archaeology needs to see itself as part of the wider environmental movement and not as something special. And in fact,
Helen Geek, of course.
Helen Geek is standing for the Green Party in Bury St Edmunds.
Yes, of course.
Helen Geek of Time Team fame, very accomplished archaeologist, expert in Anglo-Saxon, if I'm allowed to use that phrase, early medieval artifacts and so on. But she's standing for the Green Party in Bury St Edmunds, as she did last time. And in fact, although she obviously wasn't elected, she did increase the Green vote.
Right. Okay. Interesting. Incidentally, Helen Geek, I remember she was always one of my favourites on Time Team. As a kid, I'd watch it and I'd be like, somehow I could relate to her enthusiasm, if that makes sense. So okay, interesting. So now we move, I suppose, we move on to onto the Brexit Party, and then I don't know why but actually. No, let's not. We'll put them where they belong, in so much as the next party that really should be talked about in terms of prominence should be the SNP. I don't want to irritate some of my Scottish colleagues and friends. And frankly, I truly, it's just Brexit Party are not in Parliament. SNP is in Parliament. So
yes, and actually could be very influential in the event of a hung Parliament.
They could be, and also actually the SNP are ahead. We also probably arguably should have talked about them before we mentioned the Greens as well. So just for.
I justify that on the grounds that the Green Manifesto is a national manifesto, although they point to their sister parties in Scotland and Wales and Ireland.
Yeah.
But the Green programme is a national programme, whereas the SNP's programme is a programme primarily for Scotland.
But the SNP sit in Westminster.
They do sit in Westminster, that's true.
And they sit in Westminster in greater numbers than the Green Party do. The culture and creativity and creative industries contribute more.
And if any cybernats out there, I'm really sorry. Mark's absolutely right. We should have talked about you earlier.
Goodness sake, Andy, you're such a Londoner.
No, to be fair, I mean, it's important. It is important to talk about, and in fact, in the précis, I made a point of looking at all the regional parties as well, because, and particularly in we deal with the deck we're dealt, and at the moment, Westminster is a national parliament. It does elect members with national agendas from Scotland and Wales and the north of Ireland, but they also sit in Westminster as what is still the United Kingdom Parliament. Mm-hmm. So it is really, really important to engage with their particular points of view and programmes. And
interestingly, it's a related issue, but it's one of those interesting things where I often find myself reflecting on the fact that it's moments like this that Englishmen do not understand the weirdness of having to justify what you mean by national. Because the SNP are a national party. Plaid Cymru is a national party.
Oh, yeah.
It's just that our weird nation has a word, that word applies on two different levels. There's the bloc, which is the United Kingdom, and then there are the nations within the United Kingdom that are individual countries in their own right.
And increasingly identify as such.
Well, they always have, Mr. Brockman.
No. In political terms, they're increasingly
yes, I know.
as
Yes, I understand. Much less of a.
I'm not.
Much less of
Wales is Wales and Scotland is Scotland, and have been since those entities were created. I'm
Yeah.
not denying that. Absolutely not.
Actually, they've been there since the entity of England was created. There's a difference, isn't there?
Oh, don't go there.
It's important. It's important. It's very important. Cymru and Bydd. But nonetheless, so Scotland has an important part to play in Westminster, and they have a statement in their manifesto. Culture and creativity. The creative industries contribute more than 7 billion to the Scottish economy, £7 billion, and support more than 80,000 jobs. So it's good that they're actually quantifying that. They also say tourism and hospitality. Scotland's tourism industry is of huge importance to our economy, contributing 7 billion to the GDP and employing over 200,000 people. The SNP government is working to ensure that Scotland retains its reputation as an open, warm and welcoming destination. And that actually arguably is an undercurrent, it's a musical underscore to a lot of this, actually, in terms of the Brexit conversations. Is actually how the world sees Britain, because we need visitors, especially for lots of the cultural sector, historical sector, and archaeology needs that tourism element. So it's good to see the SNP talking about this. However, any risk of freedom of movement will have a catastrophic impact on our tourism sector, where EU nationals make up over 11% of the hospitality sector's workforce. And also, actually, anecdotally, I should say, quite a large proportion of visitors as well. So when we were in Northern Ireland recently, travelling into Ireland, there was a very interesting stagnation in the movement of people cross-border, just in case of being stuck in a country when things suddenly changed. So it's had a freezing impact. This political context on some of that. Can I move on to Plaid Cymru as well, and then I'll come back to Brexit? Because
Absolutely.
Plaid Cymru, which means the Party of Wales. We want to promote Wales as a high quality, sustainable tourism destination with activities and experiences based on our natural resources, our produce, our unique coastline and landscape and language and culture and heritage. There's elements here in terms of higher education. Plaid Cymru believes that higher education should be free for all. That has an impact, of course, on archaeology training and certainly archaeological degrees. Providing a subsidy for students resident in Wales who wish to study in Wales. That's interesting. That means you'd have to, for example, I would have to have gone to Cardiff or Swansea if I wanted to take advantage of that as a Welsh citizen.
Yes.
And then also planning process, creating an overarching strategic framework for planning that prioritises sustainable development and protects against environmentally damaging development. Our aim is a system that provides greater freedom for individuals to improve their own homes, but less freedom for large developers to ride roughshod over communities and indeed, for example, over things like battlefield sites, this kind of thing. So that's interesting.
That might be the aim. In practice, how that would work out, given that money usually talks in these matters, is another. You might be idealistic about this, you might be cynical about it, you might be somewhere in between.
They also mentioned transport policy. They would scrap the quote. In their words, I know that's what quote means, but I just wanted to just make it clear. Wasteful and environmentally harmful HS2 project. That would not only avoid the destruction of important habitats, it would also allow us to instead invest in public transport infrastructure and more fairly across the UK distribute that. HS2 currently swallows up 1/3 of the UK government's support for rail, £2.1 billion out of a total £6.4 billion in 2017 to 2018, and it is clear from published and leaked reports that HS2 will cost far more than the planned £56 billion. Well, they say here up to 100 billion. It's currently stated as being 88 billion, I think, isn't it? That's the most recent quote, but who knows, really?
Everybody, nobody knows. Everyone's guessing. And again, I'll come back when we wind up in a minute. I'll come back to all that. I mean, I think the other thing I'll pick up all of the parties that have their support bases in particular parts of the United Kingdom and don't stand nationally. And it has been said that if the SNP stood, because of its pro-Brexit stance in particular, if the SNP stood in candidates, particularly in certain parts of England, they probably win. Nicola Sturgeon, as party leader, is one of the most in polling comes as more respected than most. But the SNP, doesn't stand outside of Scotland. I mean, all of the regional parties obviously play to their own particular regional concerns as well. So, for example, you've got the DUP and the Alliance Party and Sinn Fein, in particular, in the north of Ireland, who are addressing issues such as getting the Stormont Assembly back up and running, running an economy that serves the whole the north of Ireland and the island of Ireland, more than just being being directed from London, and deals with wider heritage issues, including dark heritage issues, such as respecting the different community cultures that are represented in the north of Ireland. Plaid Cymru, obviously, again, it's a bilingual party. Its title is in Welsh.
Well, yes, it is. Yes, but also it's also worthwhile saying actually that the Plaid Cymru there, in mentioning HS2, I suspect one of the reasons they're mentioning that, given that it's an English railway line, is that it has an impact on this strange thing, this idea of a national budget that is actually, by some definitions, international, in some ways it's within the four countries of the United Kingdom.
Precisely, and that's something like HS2, which is situated entirely within
England.
England, sucks so money that could be used in regional development in places like the north of Wales or the north of Ireland or Scotland.
Well, and also, just knowing what it was like growing up next to one of the few main train lines in and out of England directly in Wales, it's probably going to be quite frustrating having this HS2 project that goes into Birmingham, but makes no no concession to the notion that Cardiff, for example, could be connected to that, or even further north. So that's probably one of the reasons why they're mentioning that. And I guess so you've touched on the Northern Ireland parties briefly there. Now I will, for the sake of balance, come back to Brexit Party Ltd. We keep on calling them that because they are essentially a private company, as opposed to a proper party. But and
who have produced a remarkably thin manifesto.
Or
in fact, they don't even call it manifesto; they call it a contract with the people. Which is basically predicated on what is colloquially called a hard Brexit, which is the minimum possible contact with the European Union compared to what we have now.
Well, some of the bullet points, I guess, that you've lifted from their contract, so-called abolish student loan interest. Interestingly, and actually,
this is quite populist policy.
Well, it is, and actually, and we didn't mention. To be fair, we didn't mention the Labour Party policy of tackling student loan debt in some form. The specifics of that seem to be a bit unclear. It could be abolishing all debt. It could be more like limiting or capping debt. There were various things, but that's definitely
and obviously Plaid. We've talked about Plaid's policy towards student finance
within Wales,
and within Wales, and which mirrors a similar policy in Scotland, whereas Scottish resident students don't pay tuition fees in Scotland, whereas English students going to Scottish universities do.
Exactly. So this student loan interest is an interesting tip of the hat in that direction, but it's very much, I think, on party lines, in so much as they clearly believe in free market economy and the ability to monetize the debt of people who are going to university. So we need to simplify the planning and developing process to encourage small and medium-sized developers, they say, accelerating the pace of development to increase housing supply. We pledge to simplify planning consents for brownfield sites, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, in terms of brown. Yeah, it depends on the definition of brownfield and how that's applied.
Precisely.
Change the funding model to make it easier for councils to borrow from central governments to build council houses. That sounds.
It's quite a labourish policy.
It is quite labourish, actually. Accelerate infrastructure grants funding to kickstart schemes of marginal viability. I'm not entirely sure what that means. Are they saying that they'll bring back bus routes and train lines that people remember having in the 1960s or something? Or I don't mean that to sound glib.
It's so thinly argued. It's difficult to tell with some of this. I think that it's clear from what they're saying in some of these clauses that they are going for former Labour voters, I think.
Yeah. Change the process for outline planning consent. I'm not even sure that's a good English sentence. Change the process for outline planning consent. Oh, I see. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So go on.
I just think, again, this is for archaeologists. This is one that's appearing across the board. And it's a perennial. We faced it at the last X number of elections. It's make the planning system simple, because the argument is that we're not building enough houses because the planning system's too difficult. Rubbish.
Well, and also frustratingly, the implication is that archaeologists, those beardy hippies, are part of the problem. Exactly. Yeah. Which is frustrating, but nonetheless, yeah.
Particularly given the number of cases that you and I've covered on Watching Brief, where archaeologists are seen as unethical enablers of egregious environmentally damaging projects.
We can't win. So I suppose we've been talking about this topic now for just over an hour.
Oh my goodness!
Yeah, so no, but I think that's good. It's been some solid coverage. Hopefully we've tackled some elements, or explained some elements from different parties. We set it up in terms of the wish list from the Heritage Alliance in that sense. But you were saying that you wanted to mention HS2.
I wanted to mention HS2 because of a general undercurrent which I've picked up reading all the manifestos, but also looking at the economic and political context that this is taking place in. HS2 is very expensive, as we've just discussed. The Tory party has instituted a review into HS2 now. Cynically, that's partly because it runs through a lot of Conservative constituencies and it's not popular. So therefore, suggesting to those constituencies that it might somehow or other be cancelled could be good for the local Conservative candidate.
Suggesting, however briefly.
Yes, suggesting, however briefly. Equally, the Conservative Party and Parliament committed to building a third runway at Heathrow, whereas the current Prime Minister, Mr Johnson, who, having not died in a ditch over the Brexit date, also said he'd lie down in front of the bulldozers at Heathrow, but then when the vote came, he actually arranged to be out of the country in Afghanistan.
Now, actually, can I just say, well, yes, you're right in that sense, dodging that issue, and he definitely made a dramatic statement there about not having that runway built. But one of our colleagues, Mr. Paul Blinkhorn, who I think I get a sense of his voting intentions on Twitter, he is running a fantastic daily update of the number of days that it would have been that Boris would have died in a ditch if he wasn't a liar. Yes. And I think we're currently at 30-something days. So,
we are certainly that. Yeah, no, so, Paul's been doing that, and it's wonderful.
It's hard to know.
Greatly adds to the gaiety of the nation.
It does. And the thing is, he could be a Tory. I mean, it's hard to know really what he.
You can be an equal opportunity satirist. It's certainly true.
This is true. But I mean, his general content is fantastic.
Yeah. But I mean, Paul's Twitter feed's great to follow anyway. I highly recommend it if anyone doesn't. But
of course, we're saying that just briefly. Of course, he was the biker archaeologist, so called, and pottery specialist, frequently invited onto Time Team as well. So,
absolutely, and that sadly short-lived series about pub archaeology. But no, I mean, just to finish, it's an undercurrent really I picked up from all the manifestos, and particularly with things like HS2 and third runway at Heathrow and so on. In the context of Brexit, it is at the moment the polling suggests that the Boris Johnson will get a majority. The question is how big the majority will be.
Yes.
In which case, he is committed to UK leaving the European Union on the 31st of January.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And legally, that's perfectly possible.
Well, he's still talking about getting it done by Christmas, but I think that's a pithy wartime reference, isn't it?
Yeah, it's even if they get it done by Christmas, it couldn't be before 31st of October, 31st of January, because of the EU processes that have to be gone through. Now, all of the economic forecasts suggest that there will be an economic hit from that.
Mm-hmm.
The size of that hit is what's up for question.
Mm-hmm.
And the economy is in a very fragile state anyway because of the last 3 years.
Yes.
And
well, come on, the last 10 years.
Yeah, well,
certainly in my part of the country, in the northeast.
Yeah. But again, that's a big variation. But also, there are suggestions, for example, that the world economy is in a somewhat fragile state at the moment. That places like Germany and Japan and China and so on are not booming in the way that they have been.
Mm-hmm.
And it is highly likely, therefore, that the government, whichever government comes in, but any government will be looking for cash savings. And headline cash savings lie in big projects like HS2 and the Heathrow runway and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And that would have pretty severe consequences for the large contracting archaeological units who've got a lot of resources and personnel invested in those projects and the possibility of those projects. It's also the case. Can I just make one other point? And the Greens mention it. I think they're the only party to mention specifically, but there is also the case of the Stonehenge tunnel. Yes. The Greens say they will cancel it, and I suspect if, for example, there were Green MPs going into a coalition or a confidence and supply, that one of their conditions might be, for example, to cancel the Stonehenge A303, which would have a similar effect.
Yeah.
But also a lot of archaeologists would be very, very pleased about. So basically what I'm saying is, if you add into that mix the issue around not just funding and environmental regulations and possible rollbacks on the current environmental regulations and so on, but also the issues around employing archaeologists from outside the UK and sector shortages and so on.
And whether or not we are classed as skilled labour or not, but
that's a whole other argument. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. According to the Department for Employment, my hunch, and I'm sorry to be depressing about this going into the holiday season, but I think whoever wins on December the 12th, potentially UK archaeology is in for a very rough ride.
Yeah. One of the things I was going to say in terms of clarification, and one of the reasons for that, I guess, is also the fact that so many of the companies who are providing the survey work, sometimes physical intervention in terms of excavation and survey, watching briefs even, for things like HS2, they work on essentially in arrears kind of model. So you're already, you're shelled out before you get paid. And you're doing that for multiple jobs at once, and if one as big as HS2 falls through, then that could be really bad. And the thing is, we have foreshadowed this in the past. This has been especially seeing as the budget keeps ballooning. As I say, it went up from initially 36 to 40 something to 50 something, and now it's most recently estimated at being 88. Plaid Cymru talks about 100 billion. The number seems to be unending, and the argument on the one hand for saving it and keeping it in place is that no matter what it costs, it's worth it for the national economy. In particular, one suspects for keeping London alive, so keeping the host alive, as it were, um, um,
Yeah.
by sucking essentially brains and business into the capital from the rest of the country. Hence, Plaid Cymru being against it. Um, but also, there is this element of because of it, because it's so big, because it's such a monster, that it overshadows so much of our sector.
Yeah.
And definitely, I take zero pleasure in this becoming more likely. Just
No,
because we've talked about
absolutely
this,
nobody.
and we sort of
No.
we foreshadowed it. It's not
Yeah.
remotely going to be fun or funny.
Yeah.
I suppose. Coming back then now, just briefly towards the end now, just down away from national political parties down to, I guess, the heads of bodies who run this, who basically are responsible for the direction of archaeology and its ability to be nimble in these sorts of situations. Do you see that potential for situation as having implications for national leadership of archaeology? Of course, people like Mike Hayworth are stepping down anyway at the moment. But to be blunt, if HS2 falls through, would you want to see there be a root and branch rework of how archaeology works and how it views its role? And also, frankly, for example, I mean, one of the things that's definitely, as it were, as a friend of mine who goes to a Baptist church would say, one of the things I have a heart for is career paths, the career paths that we can offer to archaeologists as being sustainable, as opposed to being gig economy basically based.
Right. I think there are a few straws in the wind, again, they're not, to me, as I read it at the moment, they're not that encouraging, or at least they're pointing towards some quite turbulent times. One is that around the issue of the Marsh Awards that we were discussing earlier, the controversy about the reception that Danny Bradford got at the Marsh Awards, and the failure of the Society of Antiquaries to kick out somebody who's a proven abuser, has been the suggestion again that there should be a single voice for UK archaeology. Now, that's always founded on the grounds that the audience that the CBA attracts in the community and the lay audience is very different to the membership of, for example, SIFA or the Society of Antiquaries, where most members are professionals in some form or other, either with contracting units or as freelancers, or with the museum sector or the university sector.
Well, and interestingly, that is by design, of course. SIFA, in particular, since it became a chartered institute, has explicitly catered itself to and seeks to define professional archaeology in some way. So there is now...
Yeah. And there are people who think that is incredibly dangerous. To have an organisation that has that kind of power, particularly in a sector which has always been so diverse previously. Now, that's one straw in the wind. The other straws in the wind are, we've got currently the University and College Union are currently on strike over very similar issues to the kind of thing that the junior doctors were striking over a few years ago. They've completely lost confidence, it would appear, in their senior management, where you've got vice chancellors on 300 grand a year, and early career academics on gig economy contracts with no fixed hours and so on,
and an ever increasing load of unpaid work.
Absolutely,
so
the expectation.
That's
right. And they're basically saying enough is enough. Now, at the moment, they're on strike. They're on strike for a few more days. It has been interesting. The archaeological social media has been full of support for those staff, but being frank, it's very difficult to see how they're going to come up with a solution to the questions they're asking in the current funding climate. It's in the nature of these things that in the end, and again, you look at what happened to the junior doctors, they had to go back. They had to end their industrial action, and so on. A deal of some kind will be put together, but it probably won't make that much difference, sadly. The other one is that staff at MOLA, the Museum of London Archaeology, one of the biggest contracting units, are striking next week. A one-day strike led by their trades union Prospect.
And to be fair, for a unit, for an organisation with as big a on the ground digging footprint as Mola, that's not insignificant. One day may sound small, but it's actually quite a lot.
Look, don't get me wrong. For at the trench face archaeologists to strike at all is remarkable. They will have been pushed a long way before making that decision.
Yeah.
So the fact that you've now got archaeologists, precisely,
yes, yeah.
The fact you've now got archaeologists who've been pushed into a position where they're actually going to walk out on work for a day is pretty nearly unprecedented in recent times, particularly with such a high-profile unit, and it's over things like hours and pensions.
Yeah.
And I suspect, again, we're only likely to see more, rather than less of this.
Yeah.
So I think it's why I was saying earlier that I think we could be in for some quite turbulent times.
Okay. But just to...
Happy Christmas.
So what I was going to say was before we wish people a happy Christmas with that. No, we do have a Christmas special coming. It's fine. We have space and time for that. How do you think then that relates to leadership? In so much as do we need that single voice in terms of a lobbying interest group to actually make any impact on things like manifestos? Are we likely to have any significant change in attitudes of senior leadership to issues ranging from, for example, sexual harassment through to provision of career pathways and pensions, this kind of thing?
Okay. I first got into this line of work 9 years ago in the wake of the appointment of the coalition government and the changes they were going to make to planning and funding, and when CBA lost its funding because of the Vince Cable's decision when he was at the Department of Business, and so on and so on and so on. So I've been looking at these issues of representation and funding and the politics of archaeology for that period of time. I think I would argue that it would have been much easier to have come up with a single voice for archaeology at that time if one was going to be achievable. Because there was a clear opponent, which was the coalition government and the funding cuts and austerity.
Well, I remember, wasn't there a campaign initially? Wasn't Tony Robinson at the launch event for it?
There were various campaigns. I mean, cards on the table. The Mortimer idea came from that. We were looking at organisations like 38 Degrees and other environmental groups like Greenpeace and so on, and saying, look, archaeology needs to follow. If we're going to have a voice at all that's going to be effective in government, we need to use those kind of methods, having a clear message and mobilising mass support and coming up with allies in the environmental movement and so on. For whatever reasons, that didn't happen.
No.
There are some big movers and shakers in the archaeological world who will be very unlikely to give up what they perceive as their positions of influence, I suspect. And I think if we couldn't do it in 2010, 2011, 2012, the chances of achieving it now are certainly no better and probably a lot worse.
So quite possibly people defending ever smaller fiefdoms and therefore being ever less effective in terms of influencing national policy.
If things go badly, that would be my suspicion as to how it would end up. Yeah. Right. I think that's when you're stressing, it's very difficult to persuade you that somebody else's stress is as important, if not more so.
Yeah.
And it's only when it's almost like the sort of the expanding and contracting universe argument to a degree. At the moment, where
not to overstate things, obviously.
things are cyclical.
Yeah.
At the moment we're seeing fragmentation, we're seeing demoralisation, we're seeing we're not seeing anyone harnessing the big picture. I think again, I'm not endorsing it in any way, but I think what Labour are trying to do with their manifesto, to finish up where we started, is to try and re-energize that idea of the big picture, that we are one community and that we work better when we work together. And everybody has the same opportunities, and everybody, and everybody is treated fairly and feels valued.
But and a crucial element of that is to recognise, because obviously this also relates to this idea of different archaeological communities and interests, and right down to local friends of sites, this kind of thing. Is that actually, if you say something along the lines of, if everyone can work together for the group of it, for the benefit of everyone, then everyone wins. Often people, even if they don't know that they've heard it, they will tend to think that what they've heard is, what you mean is I'll lose out. You know what I mean? And that there's a problem there, isn't there? That it seems to be, on the one hand, people might say it's human nature. On the other hand, you could say it's behaviour that's encouraged by the way in which jobs markets are set up and access to money is so on and so forth. There are reasons why for this, but convincing people that any policy, not just Labour, any policy that's designed to help everyone, by definition, hopefully everyone, or is aiming to help everyone, doesn't necessarily have to, or shouldn't automatically mean that you miss out. You need to be involved in shaping that to make sure that everyone wins, but also therefore you don't lose. Is that a good place to end this, in so much as encouraging sort of a form of communal activism, if that makes sense? Not too militant, but something which is actually
I don't think
buoyant.
I think at the moment I don't think at the moment anyone's in control of anything, to be frank. I think there are forces. I think there are forces. There are political and economic forces in play which nobody's even fully identified, let alone is in control of.
No.
There are people who think they are. There are people who are trying to manipulate things. The arguments about social media and targeted advertising and things like that, which we haven't even begun to talk about.
No.
But people have talked about a level playing field in the past. At the moment, the playing field's fragmenting, and people are playing by lots of different rules.
Well, and this is why you can have a prime minister who says he doesn't and does want an election. This is why you can have any number of politicians stating different things to different people on different days. Is because of this fragmenting play field. Or field of play. Okay. Well,
what a happy time we've had.
Hopefully this has been useful, if not always interesting, to you folks listening to or watching this. I guess for my part, I'm going to continue to try and find positives and buoyancy where I can. But as you say, it would be foolhardy, would it not, to simply presume that everything will be okay. Because it's not going to be okay unless we are aware of what's going on and we continue to push for what we want.
There's the old Hollywood saying, but if you want to send a message, use Western Union. But I think if there is a message out of all this, to all of our colleagues out there, certainly and particularly our colleagues and friends who have got a vote next Thursday, 12th of December, is if you have a vote, whoever you vote for, engage with the policies. We've talked in a very loose way about pretty much all of the ones that are relevant to our sector. But above all, your people, your members of the community, engage with the arguments, go out and vote, and then whatever the result of the election, stay engaged afterward. Because I think, as I say, we're in for a very interesting time, shall we say.
Yeah, don't disengage.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Go out and put that cross in that box for somebody.
Yeah. Or even if you have to, spoil your ballot.
Write a giant penis on it or something, which people have in the past posted pictures of. But remember, don't take any pictures inside the voting booth because that's illegal.
Yeah. That's something to end on. Okay. Thank you for your time today, Andy. Thank you guys for listening and or watching at home. Normal service will be resumed in the shape of our Christmas special at the end of the month, and hopefully we'll be able to find a finishing point for that isn't just hey.
You know what, Mark? It might be the first watching brief I've ever done when I will have been paralytically drunk.
Oh, really?
Which it depends on how things pan out for the rest of the month.
Oh goodness me, yes, because it'll be post-election, won't it? Yes, of course.
Absolutely. I'm normally teetotal. I mean, this is cold coffee, actually. But, yeah, we shall see how things go.
I'm looking forward to playing charades with that. Yeah, that'll be interesting. Yeah. Oh well, bleh, whatever.
Well, there is that hit series called Drunk History on that certain cable channel, isn't there?
Of course, yes, Drunk History. Yeah.
I think we should do drunk. Actually, yeah, we should do drunk watching brief.
Well, it would have to be at least an afternoon recording session. We couldn't start in the morning, could we? That'd be terrible.
Oh, I don't know if the sun's over the yard arm. Have a very low yard arm.
Indeed, I'll be. Actually, I've got a mallet with me. I can be hammering at the yard arm. I'll get on that tonight, and then we'll have a nice low yard arm.
I used to have a job. I used to work next to Borough Market when it was still a working fruit and veg market, and the pub there, wonderful pub there called the in Southwark. And there's a wonderful pub there called the Market Porter, and it used to open at something like 5 a.m. It had a special license. It used to open at something like 5 a.m. for the Market Porter. So we'd go into work at sort of 8 in the morning. We'd pop in for a pint before we started. It's terrible. Anyway.
And that's exactly why our sector is such a varied and broad church. It's because we have such a wide array of different people who are archaeologists. Once again, thank you everyone for watching. Very important people. Thank you for watching. Thank you very much, Andy, and we'll see you later this month in December for the Christmas special. Looking forward to it. Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Don't let go of me.